The therapy room was a small, narrow rectangle, as bare as a prison cell or barer. The window was closed and barred. A bright pink box of tissues on the small table struck a discordantly cheerful note. Presumably it was placed there by Indira. I couldn't imagine Christian offering tissues to his patients. I sat on one of two battered, faded armchairs. The minutes passed. No sign of Alicia. Perhaps she wasn't coming. Perhaps she had refused to meet me. She would be perfectly within her rights. Impatient, anxious, nervous, I abandoned sitting and jumped up and walked to the window. I peered out between the bars. The courtyard was 3 stories below me. The size of a tennis court, it was surrounded by tall red brick walls that were too high to climb, though doubtless some had tried. Patients were herded outside for 30 minutes of fresh air every afternoon, whether they wanted it or not, and in this freezing weather I didn't blame them for resisting. Some stood alone, muttering to themselves, or they paced back and forth like restless zombies going nowhere. Others huddled in groups, talking, smoking, arguing. Voices and shouts and strange, excitable laughter floated up to me. I couldn't see Alicia at first, then I located her. She was standing alone at the far end of the courtyard, by the wall, perfectly still, like a statue. Yuri walked across the courtyard toward her. He spoke to the nurse standing a few feet away. The nurse nodded. Yuri went up Alicia cautiously, slowly, as you might approach an unpredictable animal. I had asked him not to go into too much detail, merely to tell Alicia the new psychotherapist at the unit would like to meet her. I requested he phrase it as a request, not a demand. Alicia stood still as he spoke to her, but she neither nodded nor shook her head, nor gave any indication of having heard him. After a brief pause, Yuri turned and walked off. Well, that's it, I thought. She won't come. Fuck it, I should have known. The whole thing has been a waste of time. Then, to my surprise, Alicia took a step forward. Faltering a little, she shuffled after Yuri across the courtyard until they disappeared from view under my window. So she was coming. I tried to contain my nerves and prepare myself. I tried to silence the negative voice in my head, my father's voice, telling me I wasn't up to the job, I was useless, a fraud. Shut up, I thought. Shut up, shut up. A couple of minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Come in. The door opened. Alicia was standing with Yuri in the corridor. I looked at her, but she didn't look at me. Her gaze remained downcast. Yuri gave me a proud smile. She's here. Yes, I can see that. Hello, Alicia. She didn't respond. Won't you come in? Yuri leaned forward as if to nudge her, but he didn't actually touch her. Instead, he whispered, Go on, honey. Go in and take a seat. Alicia hesitated. She glanced at him, then made a decision. She walked into the room, slightly unsteadily. She sat on a chair, silent as a cat, her trembling hands in her lap. I was about to shut the door, but Yuri didn't leave. I lowered my voice. I can take it from here, thanks. Yuri looked worried. But she's on one-on-one, and the professor said, I'll take full responsibility. It's quite all right. I took my personal attack alarm out of my pocket. See, I have this, but I won't need it. I glanced at Alicia. She gave no indication she had even heard me. Yuri shrugged, obviously unhappy. I'll be on the other side of the door, just in case you need me. That's not necessary, but thanks. Yuri left, and I closed the door. I placed the alarm on the desk. I sat opposite Alicia. She didn't look up. I studied her for a moment. Her face was expressionless, blank, a medicated mask. I wondered what lay beneath. I'm glad you agreed to see me. I waited for a response. I knew there wouldn't be one. I have the advantage of knowing more about you than you do about me. Your reputation precedes you. Your reputation as a painter, I mean. I'm a fan of your work. No reaction. I shifted in my seat slightly. I asked Professor Diomedes if we might talk, and he kindly arranged this meeting. Thank you for agreeing to it. I hesitated, hoping for an acknowledgement of some kind, a blink, a nod, a frown. Nothing came. I tried to guess what she was thinking. Perhaps she was too drugged up to think anything at all. I thought of my old therapist, Ruth. What she would do. She used to say we are made up of different parts, some good, some bad, and that a healthy mind can tolerate this ambivalence and juggle both good and bad at the same time. Mental illness is precisely about a lack of this kind of integration. We end up losing contact with the unacceptable parts of ourselves. If I was to help Alicia, we would have to locate the parts she had hidden from herself beyond the fringes of consciousness and connect the various dots in her mental landscape. Only then could we put into context the terrible events of that night she killed her husband. It would be a slow, laborious process. Normally, when beginning with a patient, there is no sense of urgency, no predetermined therapeutic agenda. Normally, we start with many months of talking. In an ideal world, Alicia would tell me about herself, her life, her childhood. I would listen, slowly building up a picture until it was complete enough for me to make accurate, helpful interpretations. In this case, there would be no talking, no listening. The information I needed would have to be gathered through nonverbal clues, such as my countertransference, the feelings Alicia engendered in me during the sessions, and whatever information I could gather from other sources. In other words, I had set into motion a plan to help Alicia without actually knowing how to execute it. Now I had to deliver, not just to prove myself to Diomedes, but far more important, to do my duty to Alicia, to help her. Looking at her sitting opposite me, in a medicated haze, drool collecting around her mouth, fingers fluttering like dirty moths, I experienced a sudden and unexpected wrench of sadness. I felt desperately sorry for her, and those like her, for all of us, all the wounded and the lost. Of course, I said none of this to her. Instead, I did what Ruth would have done, and we simply sat in silence. Chapter 8, I opened Alicia's file on my desk. Diomedes had volunteered it. You must read my notes, they will help you. I had no desire to wade through his notes. I already knew what Diomedes thought. I needed to find out what I thought. But nonetheless, I accepted it politely. Thank you, that will be such a help. My office was small and sparsely furnished, tucked away at the back of the building by the fire escape. I looked out the window. A little black bird was pecking at a patch of frozen grass on the ground outside, dispiritedly and without much hope. I shivered. The room was freezing. The small radiator under the window was broken. Yuri said he'd try to get it fixed, but that my best bet was to talk to Stephanie, or, failing that, bring it up in community. I felt a sudden pang of empathy with Elif and her battle to get the broken pool cue replaced. I looked through Alicia's file without much expectation. The majority of the information I needed was in the online database. Diomedes, however, like a lot of older staff members, preferred to write his reports by hand and, ignoring Stephanie's nagging request to the contrary, continued to do so. Hence the dog-eared file in front of me. I flicked through Diomedes' notes, ignoring his somewhat old-fashioned psychoanalytic interpretations, and focused on the nurse's handover reports of Alicia's day-to-day behaviour. I read through those reports carefully. I wanted facts, figures, details. I needed to know exactly what I was getting into, what I'd have to deal with, and if any surprises were in store. I wasn't sure why this incident drew my attention, but it didn't feel right to me. I decided to approach Elif and ask her about it. I tore off a sheet of paper from a pad and reached for my pen. An old habit, formed at university. Something about putting pen to paper helps me organise my mind. I've always had difficulty formulating an opinion until I've written it down. I began scribbling ideas, notes, goals, devising a plan of attack. To help Alicia, I needed to understand her and her relationship with Gabriel. Did she love him, hate him? What happened to make her kill him? Why had she refused to speak about the murder or anything else? No answers, not yet, just questions. I wrote down a word and underlined it. Alcestis. The self-portrait. It was important somehow, I knew that, and understanding why would be central to unlocking this mystery. This painting was Alicia's sole communication, her only testimony. It was saying something I had yet to comprehend. I made a note to revisit the gallery, to look at the painting again. I wrote down another word: childhood. If I was to make sense of Gabriel's murder, I needed to understand not only the events of the night. Alicia killed him, but also the events of the distant past. The seeds of what happened in those few minutes when she shot her husband were probably sown years earlier. Murderous rage, homicidal rage, is not born in the present. It originates in the land before memory, in the world of early childhood, with abuse and mistreatment, which builds up a charge over the years until it explodes, often at the wrong target. I needed to find out how her childhood had shaped her, and if Alicia couldn't or wouldn't tell me, I had to find someone who would. Someone who knew Alicia before the murder, who could help me understand her history, who she was, and how she ended up this way. In the file, Alicia's next of kin was listed as her aunt, Lydia Rose, who brought her up, following the death of Alicia's mother in a car accident. Alicia had also been in the car crash, but survived. That trauma must have affected the little girl profoundly. I hoped Lydia would be able to tell me about it. The only other contact was Alicia's lawyer, Max Berenson. Max was Gabriel Berenson's brother. He was perfectly placed to observe their marriage intimately. Whether Max Berenson would confide in me was another matter. An unsolicited approach to Alicia's family by her psychotherapist was unorthodox, to say the least. I had a dim feeling Diomedes would not approve. Better not ask his permission, I decided, in case he refused. As I look back, this was my first professional transgression in dealing with Alicia, setting an unfortunate precedent for what followed. I should have stopped there. But even then it was too late to stop. In many ways, my fate was already decided, like in a Greek tragedy. I reached for the phone. I called Max Berenson at his office, using the contact number listed in Alicia's file. It rang several times before it was answered. "The offices of Elliot, Barrow and Berenson," said a receptionist with a bad cold. "Mr. Berenson, please." "May I ask who is calling?" "My name is Theo Faber. I'm a psychotherapist at the Grove. I was wondering if it might be possible to have a word with Mr. Berenson about his sister-in-law." There was a slight pause before she responded. "Oh, I see. Well, Mr. Berenson is out of the office for the rest of the week. He's in Edinburgh visiting a client. If you leave your number, I'll have him call you on his return." I gave her my number and hung up. I dialed the next number in the file, Alicia's aunt, Lydia Rose. It was answered on the first ring. An elderly woman's voice sounded breathless and rather annoyed. "Yes, what is it?" "Is that Mrs. Rose? Who are you?" "I'm calling regarding your niece, Alicia Berenson. I'm a psychotherapist working at the—" "Fuck off," she hung up. I frowned to myself. Not a good start. Chapter 9. I desperately needed a cigarette. As I left the Grove, I looked for them in my coat pockets, but they weren't there. "Looking for something?" I turned around. Yuri was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard him, and I was a little startled to find him so close. "I found them in the nurse's station," he grinned, handing me my pack of cigarettes. "Must have fallen out of your pocket." "Thanks." I took them and lit one. I offered him the packet. Yuri shook his head. "I don't smoke, not cigarettes anyway." He laughed. "You look like you need a drink. Come on, I'll buy you a pint." I hesitated. My instinct was to refuse. I had never been one for socializing with work colleagues, and I doubted Yuri and I had much in common, but he probably knew Alicia better than anyone else at the Grove, and his insights might prove useful. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" We went to a pub near the station, the Slaughtered Lamb. Dark and dingy, it had seen better days. So had the old men dozing over their half-finished pints. Yuri got us a couple of beers, and we sat at a table at the back. Yuri took a long swig of beer and wiped his mouth. "Well, tell me about Alicia." Alicia? How did you find her? I'm not sure I did find her. Yuri gave me a quizzical look, then smiled. She doesn't want to be found. Yeah, it's true. She's hiding. You're close to her. I can see that. I take special care of her. No one knows her like I do, not even Professor Diomedes. His voice had a boastful note. It annoyed me for some reason. I wondered how well he really knew her, or if he was just bragging. What do you make of her silence? What do you think it means? Yuri shrugged. I guess it means she's not ready to talk. She'll talk when she's ready. Ready for what? Ready for the truth, my friend. And what is that? Yuri cocked his head to one side slightly, studying me. The question that came out of his mouth surprised me. Are you married, Theo? I nodded. I am, yes. Yeah, I thought so. I was married once too. We moved here from Latvia, but she didn't fit in like I did. She didn't make an effort, you know. She didn't learn English. Anyway, I wasn't happy, but I was in denial, lying to myself. He drained his drink and completed his sentence. Until I fell in love. Presumably you don't mean with your wife. Yuri laughed and shook his head. Number A woman who lived near me, a very beautiful woman. It was love at first sight. I saw her on the street. It took me a long time to get the courage to talk her. I used to follow her. I'd watch her sometimes, without her knowing. I'd stand outside her house and look, hoping she would appear at the window. He laughed. This story was starting to make me feel uncomfortable. I finished my beer and glanced at my watch, hoping Yuri would take the hint, but he didn't. One day I tried speaking to her, but she wasn't interested in me. I tried a few times, but she told me to stop pestering her. I didn't blame her, I thought. I was about to make my excuses, but Yuri kept talking. It was very hard to accept. I was sure we were meant to be together. She broke my heart. I got very angry with her, very mad. And what happened? I was curious despite myself. Nothing. Nothing? You stayed with your wife. Yuri shook his head. Number it was over with her. But it took falling for this woman for me to admit it, to face the truth about me and my wife. Sometimes it takes courage, you know, and a long time, to be honest. I see. And you think Alicia's not ready to face the truth about her marriage? Is that what you're saying? You may well be right. Yuri shrugged. And now I'm engaged to a nice girl from Hungary. She works in a spa. She speaks good English. We're a good match. We have a good time. I nodded and checked my watch again. I picked up my coat. I have to go. I'm late to meet my wife. Okay, no problem. What's her name? Your wife? For some reason, I didn't want to tell him. I didn't want Yuri to know anything about her. But that was stupid. Catherine. Her name is Catherine, but I call her Kathy. Yuri gave me an odd smile. Let me give you some advice. Go home to your wife. Go home to Kathy, who loves you. And leave Alicia behind. Chapter 10. I went to meet Kathy at the National Theatre Cafe on the South Bank, where the performers would often congregate after rehearsal. She was sitting at the back of the cafe with a couple of fellow actresses, deep in conversation. They looked up at me as I approached. Are your ears burning, darling? Kathy said as she kissed me. Should they be? I'm telling the girls all about you. Ah, should I leave? Don't be silly. Sit down. It's perfect timing. I've just got to how we met. I sat down and Kathy continued her story. It was a story she enjoyed telling. She occasionally glanced in my direction and smiled, as if to include me. But the gesture was perfunctory, for this was her tale, not mine. I was sitting at a bar when he finally showed up. At last, when I'd given up hope of ever finding him, in he walked, the man of my dreams. Better late than never. I thought I was going to be married by the time I was 25, you know. By 30, I was going to have 2 kids, small dog, big mortgage. But here I was, 33-ish, and things hadn't quite gone to plan. Kathy said this with an arch smile and winked at the girls. Anyway, I was seeing this Australian guy called Daniel. But he didn't want to get married or have kids anytime soon, so I knew I was wasting my time. And we were out one night when suddenly it happened. Mr. Right walked in. Kathy looked at me and smiled and rolled her eyes. With his girlfriend. This part of the story needed careful handling to retain her audience's sympathy. Kathy and I were both dating other people when we met. Double infidelity isn't the most attractive or auspicious start to a relationship, particularly as we were introduced to each other by our then partners. They knew each other for some reason. I can't remember the precise details. Marianne had once gone out with Daniel's flatmate possibly, or the other way around. I don't remember exactly how we were introduced, but I do remember the first moment I saw Kathy. It was like an electric shock. I remember her long black hair, piercing green eyes, her mouth. She was beautiful, exquisite, an angel. At this point in telling the tale, Kathy paused and smiled and reached for my hand. Remember, Theo, how we got talking? You said you were training to be a shrink, and I said I was nuts, so it was a match made in heaven. This got a big laugh from the girls. Kathy laughed too and glanced at me sincerely, anxiously, her eyes searching mine. No, but, darling, seriously, it was love at first sight, wasn't it? This was my cue. I nodded and kissed her cheek. Of course it was. True love. This received a look of approval from her friends. But I wasn't performing. She was right. It was love at first sight. Well, lust anyway. Even though I was with Marianne that night, I couldn't keep my eyes off Kathy. I watched her from a distance, talking animatedly to Daniel, and then I saw her lips mouth. Fuck you. They were arguing. It looked heated. Daniel turned and walked out. You're being quiet, Marianne said. What's wrong? Nothing. Let's go home then. I'm tired. Not yet. I was only half listening. Let's have another drink. I want to go now. Then go. Marianne shot me a hurt look, then grabbed her jacket and walked out. I knew there'd be a row the next day, but I didn't care. I made my way over to Kathy at the bar. Is Daniel coming back? Number, how about Marianne? I shook my head. Number, would you like another drink? Yes, I would. So we ordered 2 more drinks. We stood at the bar talking. We discussed my psychotherapy training, I remember. And Kathy told me about her stint at drama school. She didn't stay long, as she signed up with an agent at the end of her first year and had been acting professionally ever since. I imagined, without knowing why, that she was probably rather a good actress. Studying wasn't for me, she said. I wanted to get out there and do it, you know? Do what? Act? Number, live? Kathy tilted her head, looking out from under her dark lashes, her emerald green eyes peering at me mischievously. So, Theo, how do you have the patience to keep doing it? Studying, I mean. Maybe I don't want to get out there and live. Maybe I'm a coward. Number, if you were a coward, you'd have gone home with your girlfriend. Kathy laughed, a surprisingly wicked laugh. I wanted to grab her and kiss her hard. I'd never experienced such overwhelming physical desire before. I wanted to pull her close, feel her lips and the heat of her body against mine. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have said that. I always say whatever pops into my head. I told you, I'm a bit nuts. Kathy did that a lot, protesting her insanity. I'm crazy. I'm nuts. I'm insane. But I never believed her. She laughed too easily and too often for me to believe she'd ever suffered the kind of darkness I had experienced. She had a spontaneity, a lightness. She took a delight in living and was endlessly amused by life. Despite her protestations, she seemed the least crazy person I'd ever known. Around her, I felt more sane. Kathy was American. She was born and brought up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Her English mother gave Kathy dual citizenship, but Kathy didn't seem even remotely English. She was determinedly, distinctly un-English, not just in the way she spoke, but in the way she saw the world and how she approached it. Such confidence, such exuberance. I'd never met anyone like her. We left the bar, hailed a cab. I gave the address of my flat. We rode the short journey in silence. When we arrived, she gently pressed her lips to mine. I broke through my reserve and pulled her toward me. We kept kissing as I fumbled with the key to the front door. We were scarcely inside before we were undressing, stumbling into the bedroom, falling onto the bed. That night was the most erotic, blissful night of my life. I spent hours exploring Kathy's body. We made love all night until dawn. I remember so much white everywhere. White sunlight creeping around the edges of the curtains. White walls, white bed sheets. The whites of her eyes, her teeth, her skin. I'd never known that skin could be so luminous, so translucent. Ivory white with occasional blue veins visible just beneath the surface, like threads of colour in white marble. She was a statue, a Greek goddess come to life in my hands. We lay there wrapped in each other's arms. Kathy was facing me, her eyes so close they were out of focus. I gazed into a hazy green sea. "Well?" she said. "Well? What about Marianne?" "Marianne?" A flicker of a smile. "Your girlfriend?" "Oh, yes, yes." I hesitated, unsure. "I don't know about Marianne and Daniel." Kathy rolled her eyes. "Forget Daniel. Have you really?" Kathy responded by kissing me. Before Kathy left, she took a shower. While she was showering, I phoned Marianne. I wanted to arrange to see her, to tell her face to face, but she was annoyed about the previous night and insisted we have it out then and there, on the phone. Marianne wasn't expecting me to break up with her, but that's what I did, as gently as I could. She started crying and became upset and angry. I hung up on her. Brutal, yes, and unkind. I'm not proud of that phone call, but it seemed like the only honest action to take. I still don't know what I could have done differently. On our first proper date, Kathy and I met at Kew Gardens. It was her idea. She was astonished I'd never been. "You're kidding. You've never gone to the greenhouses. There's this big one with all the tropical orchids and they keep it so hot, it's like an oven. When I was at drama school, I used to go and hang out there just to warm up. How about we meet there after you finish work?" Then she hesitated, suddenly unsure. "Or is it too far for you to go?" "I'd go further than Kew Gardens for you, darling." "Idiot," she kissed me. Kathy was waiting at the entrance when I arrived, in her enormous coat and scarf, waving like an excited child. Come on, follow me." She led me through the frozen mud to the big glass structure that housed the tropical plants and pushed open the door and charged inside. I followed her and was immediately struck by the sudden rise in temperature, an onslaught of heat. I tore off my scarf and coat. Kathy smiled. "See, I told you, it's like a sauna. Ain't it great?" We walked around along the paths, carrying our coats, holding hands, looking at the exotic flowers. I felt an unfamiliar happiness just being in her company, as though a secret door had been opened, and Kathy had beckoned me across the threshold, into a magical world of warmth and light and colour, and hundreds of orchids in a dazzling confetti of blues and reds and yellows. I could feel myself thawing in the heat, softening around the edges, like a tortoise emerging into the sun after a long winter's sleep, blinking and waking up. Kathy did that for me. She was my invitation to life, one I grasped with both hands. So this is it, I remember thinking. This is love. I recognized it without question and knew clearly that I'd never experienced anything like this before. My previous romantic encounters had been brief, unsatisfactory for all concerned. As a student, I had summoned up the nerve, aided by a considerable amount of alcohol, to lose my virginity to a Canadian sociology student called Meredith, who wore sharp metal braces that cut into my lips as we kissed. A string of uninspired relationships followed. I never seemed to find the special connection I longed for. I had believed I was too damaged, too incapable of intimacy. But now, every time I heard Kathy's contagious giggle, a wave of excitement ran through me. Through a kind of osmosis, I absorbed her youthful exuberance, her unself-consciousness and joy. I said yes to her every suggestion and every whim. I didn't recognize myself. I liked this new person, this unafraid man Kathy inspired me to be. We fucked all the time. I was consumed with lust, perpetually, urgently hungry for her. I needed to keep touching her. I couldn't get close enough. Kathy moved in with me that December into my one-bedroom apartment in Kentish Town. The dank, thickly carpeted basement flat had windows, but with no view. Our first Christmas together, we were determined to do it properly. We bought a tree from the stall by the tube station and dressed it with a jumble of decorations and lights from the market. I remember vividly the scent of pine needles and wood and candles burning, and Kathy's eyes staring into mine, sparkling, twinkling like the lights on the tree. I spoke without thinking. The words just came out. "Will you marry me?" Kathy stared at me. "What?" "I love you, Kathy. Will you marry me?" Kathy laughed. Then, to my joy and amazement, she said, "Yes." The next day, we went out and she chose a ring, and the reality of the situation dawned on me. We were engaged. Bizarrely, the first people I thought of were my parents. I wanted to introduce Kathy to them. I wanted them to see how happy I was, that I had finally escaped, that I was free. So we got the train to Surrey. In hindsight, it was a bad idea, doomed from the start. My father greeted me with typical hostility. "You look terrible, Theo. You're too thin. Your hair is too short. You look like a convict." "Thanks, Dad. Good to see you too." My mother seemed more depressed than usual, quieter, smaller somehow, as if she weren't there. Dad was a heavier presence, unfriendly, glaring, unsmiling. He didn't take his cold, dark eyes off Kathy the entire time. It was an uncomfortable lunch. They didn't seem to like her, nor did they seem particularly happy for us. I don't know why I was surprised. After lunch, my father disappeared into his study. He didn't emerge again. When my mother said goodbye, she held on to me for too long, too closely, and was unsteady on her feet. I felt desperately sad. When Kathy and I left the house, part of me hadn't left, I knew, but had remained behind. Forever a child, trapped. I felt lost, hopeless, close to tears. Then Kathy surprised me, as always. She threw her arms around me, pulling me into a hug. "I understand now," she whispered in my ear. "I understand it all. I love you so much more now." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. We were married in April, in a small registry office off Euston Square. No parents invited, and no God. Nothing religious, at Kathy's insistence. But I said a secret prayer during the ceremony. I silently thanked him for giving me such unexpected, undeserved happiness. I saw things clearly now. I understood his greater purpose. God hadn't abandoned me during my childhood when I had felt so alone and so scared. He had been keeping Kathy hidden up his sleeve, waiting to produce her like a deft magician. I felt such humility and gratitude for every second we spent together. I was aware how lucky, how incredibly fortunate I was to have such love, how rare it was, and how others weren't so lucky. Most of my patients weren't loved. Alicia Berenson wasn't. It's hard to imagine two women more different than Kathy and Alicia. Kathy makes me think of light, warmth, colour, and laughter. When I think of Alicia, I think only of depth, of darkness, of sadness, of silence. Part 1. Over Part 2 will be continue.